We've wondered more than once on this podcast whether we're living through a landmark era, namely the end of the age of American hegemony. We've considered a few key moments as possible signposts of that change. At the beginning of this season, I wondered, in an extended audio essay, if an extravagant military parade in Beijing might signal the coming into maturity of China's status as the key 21st century challenger to established American dominance. Earlier in the year, the realist thinker Robert Kaplan identified the MAGA-driven gutting of the diplomatic service as an indicator of the United States' waning global influence. And of course, Omar Al-Akkad, who, since recording with us earlier this year, went on to win a National Book Award for his book, One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This, saw in the Gaza War the end of the worldview that had enabled it, in the West and particularly in the United States. I have, as listeners to those podcasts will have heard, reservations about the idea that the American era is coming to a close anytime soon. Yet the idea that the United States not only does, but should remain at the center of global geopolitics is becoming rarer and, dare I say, especially now at the end of this turbulent, extraordinary year, rather unfashionable. But it hasn't disappeared entirely. The author and political scientist Shadi Hamid has just published his latest book. Its title, The Case for American Power, is a lot more provocative than it might have been even just a few years ago. I followed Shadi's work for some time. He has written thoughtfully on liberalism and democracy and how those two ideas are not always natural bedfellows. He's also written on political Islam, a topic we discuss in this interview. I think he's one of the few Western thinkers who treats the subject with the seriousness it deserves. Shadi himself needed some persuading as to the case for American power, given his long-established skepticism for US foreign policy disasters such as the Iraq War. As he concedes, he's almost the audience for his own book. Listeners will hear that I'm not entirely persuaded by all of Shadi's arguments, but he makes them in good faith, and he's clearly given them plenty of thought. He's not trying to say that America has always wielded its power responsibly or effectively, but he holds out hope that it can do so in the future. Indeed, Shadi maintains that an American-dominated world order is not only desirable, but necessary. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead. Shadi Hamid, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Faisal. Thanks so much for having me.
You've written this book, which is a moral, philosophical argument for why American power is a good thing. And I suppose in some ways I was thinking it's a continuation of some of your arguments from before, particularly in the problem of democracy. So I wanted to kind of start with your own intellectual journey on it, because for somebody, you're somebody who calls themselves a liberal, and I think for you to be now advocating US power, that's a kind of unconventional route.
It is unconventional. I've been a fierce critic of American foreign policy for a long time, especially in the Middle East. I think we have, in some ways, a terrible record. And a big part of that is supporting brutal, repressive regimes throughout the region. And I think that people like Noam Chomsky were right about certain things, and that's sort of how I came of age. I was an anti-war activist post 9/11. The Iraq War seemed like such an obviously stupid thing, and it made me angry, and I organized around that. And that was a big part of my story of how I became politicized. But I think over time, a lot of things happened. And I think one thing I realized is I didn't want to be a protester my whole life. I didn't want to be on the outside looking in. There was a sense of powerlessness that came during that period. We were out there with signs outside the White House, protesting every week. There was a big mass coordinated protest, I remember it, in early 2003, millions of people across the globe. It was incredible, and we thought we could stop the war, but we didn't. And then I saw what was happening on the other side of the ledger, which was a small group of ideologically committed people around George W. Bush, the so-called neocons. They were able to capture the levers of power and move America in this dangerous direction. So for me, there was almost like a choice there. Do we contend with power and wrestle with power and try to seek power, or do we take the easy way out and insist on our moral righteousness and moral purity. And I was willing to compromise some of the moral purity to be more in the system and to get, I don't want to say that I got my hands dirty necessarily, because I haven't been a policymaker myself, but being at think tanks, trying to influence policymakers, trying to speak to that audience, I thought that was a better way of approaching things. I'm still, and I think I'll always be, a fierce critic of American foreign policy in different ways. But I think I also realize that there is no other option than American power. That power is a fact, someone has to wield it, and the only question is who. So in some sense, my book, it's not the case for American power as much as it's a case for American power, a particular understanding of the American idea.
Yeah. Well, so one of the questions that I had as I was reading the book was to ask, I wonder who he's writing this for. Because you can take aim at parts of the left who, as you say, they're very uncomfortable, not merely, as I've heard you say in other places, not just uncomfortable with power, they seem to be uncomfortable with the very political process itself. They don't want to be involved in having to make these contentious decisions, which is the nature of politics in itself. But I wondered whether that's partly who you're aiming the book at. But also, I think in some ways you're aiming the book at people on the center left who are uncomfortable with the way that American power has been expressed, particularly abroad.
Yeah, I think one of my primary audience is certainly leftists and center-left folks who are skeptical of American power, who are losing faith. Also, Arabs and Muslims who I think are really struggling with what to think about America after Gaza. I mean, for so many of us, Gaza has been a breaking point, and I see so many of my friends almost giving up hope in the American idea that this is the end. And Gaza was sort of a hinge point in the broader sweep of history. I think that's premature, and I wouldn't want us to resign ourselves to our fate. So I am trying to persuade people who are skeptical and try to find a balance, to try to find a way to make the case for America that acknowledges our sins and takes them seriously, but also says, just because we've done very bad things in the past doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat them. I don't think that's a foregone conclusion. We shouldn't accept that.
What do you think? I understand the message to people on the left, which is to get involved in American power and try to be involved in some way in these decisions, in the same way that you say the neocons kind of capture the upper echelons of political power. Well, it's possible for other groups to do that. But what do you think your message would be then to people outside America who are not citizens? You talk about Arabs and Muslims, for example.
Yeah, I was thinking more Arab and Muslim Americans.
I see. Right.
But if we're talking about Arabs and Muslims elsewhere, I think I have a pretty uphill case.
Right,
I mean,
right. Well, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, right.
They've been on the receiving end of American power, and that's been destructive. But at the same time, I do remember when I was in Tahrir Square in 2011, and the crowds were hanging on Barack Obama's every word because they understood at some basic level that there was hope in America, that if America said the right things at the right time, that could actually push Mubarak out of power. And that ultimately did happen, in part because of the pressure that Obama was putting. And when he basically said that he had lost confidence in Mubarak. So I think, but also Syrian protesters and during the civil war, when they were calling for American intervention against the Assad regime, or Libyans, when they were being killed by Gaddafi, they weren't looking to China or Russia. At the end of the day, America was their last best hope.
Well, we'll come to some of those conversations about Libya and Syria and definitely about Gaza. But I wanted to talk about this example, because I've heard you give this example before of Tahrir and saying, well, the protesters were waiting to hear what Obama had to say. And you have, in my opinion, framed it as a way that the protesters in Tahrir were looking around the world and they're saying, well, who can help us with Mubarak? The glorious Americans on the Hill can do that. But that's not why they were doing it. They were doing it because Obama was the paymaster of Mubarak. The Chinese were not providing the second largest amount of foreign funding to the Egyptians. That was the Americans. So it mattered what the paymaster says. Just as in any organization, if the boss doesn't like you, you have to leave. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, they understood who the patron was, that's for sure. But at the same time, they had an expectation that America might actually be able to live up to its own rhetoric. That because we had talked about democracy so much, because Obama had said things about the aspirations of Arabs in the region, they thought that maybe we could live up to that. So I think there is a sense of optimism and almost a kind of idealism that people still have about America, that we can be better than we actually are.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. And I think that idealism is something you see both at home and abroad. So it's not just that people abroad think that about the Americans, it's also that people at home think it. Like, people want America to be better, and they talk about that idealism.
And that's part of the reason why I think so many Arabs in the region are so angry and feel so betrayed by America, because they have higher expectations.
Right.
Because they see the ideals and then they see the reality, and they ask themselves, why doesn't America live up to its own rhetoric? And I want us to close the gap, or at least to try to close the gap.
Your explanation of your answer to that question is what? Why doesn't America live up to that? Because you think that there is a small group of people, the neocons, who are changing the policy, or because you think that there are inherent American interests in the region? What is your explanation for that?
I think a big part of the problem is that democracy is great in theory, but it's hard to actually practice it in real life and believe in it. Democracy can be scary. So Americans say they like democracy, but when they see what democracy produces in the Middle East, they say, well, wait a second, Islamist parties are the ones who are winning. The Muslim Brotherhood keeps on coming out on top. What do we do about that? And that tension, I think, is at the heart of why America has struggled so much in the Middle East. There is also these deep structural interests that we think we have to uphold. And we're so worried about chaos and uncertainty that we don't want to put anything to chance. No one wants to be bold in the Middle East because they're worried about the repercussions. There's such a fear of instability. But my argument has always been supporting dictators has not led to stability. It's led to the opposite. The Middle East has produced chaos and extremism and conflict for the last several decades. So the approach of American policymakers has been faulty at the very heart of it. Not everyone agrees with me. And I think it's hard to persuade people because they feel there's a tension between interests and ideals. And I think if that's the way you see it, you tend to fall back on interests and the old way of doing things.
Right. But you are persuaded that there is such a thing as idealism at the heart of the American project.
I think that idealism has come through in other regions. You know, towards the end of the Cold War, we started putting pressure on authoritarian regimes in other regions in Latin America, Africa, Asia. We facilitated democratic transitions in the early 90s in Eastern Europe, everywhere except for the Middle East. So I do think there is a Middle East exception that has to do specifically with our fear of Islamism.
That's interesting.
And if we can get over that fear, we can be more consistent, and we can finally address this kind of gaping hole in our rhetoric.
So you look around the world at various regions, and you do think that there is an exception in the way that America works and deals with the Middle East.
Don't get me wrong, it's still pretty checkered in Latin America, and we continue to do bad things in certain countries and not always supporting the democratically elected leaders. But I think on balance, the U.S. has improved considerably in other regions compared to what it was doing during the Cold War, which was this unquestioning support of right-wing dictators. So I do think there is something special about the Middle East, and it's not just about the fear of Islamism. It's also about our obsessive, our kind of preoccupation with Israel's security at the expense of everything else. We've made that one of the pillars of our policy, and we're afraid that anything that challenges Israel's dominance in the region or challenges their security, that's something that we want to fight or avoid or resist. And the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of Arabs in the region are anti-Israel. They want to challenge Israel's hegemony. So democracy would mean giving those sentiments more of an airing. And I think America's afraid of how that might affect the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Yeah. I'll come back to Gaza because I wanted to keep going with your argument in particular about why it's so important to have American power, American dominance in the world. And what I think is one of the core reasons that you believe that this power is necessary is because of the alternatives. And so if you look in the book, you say that one of the reasons for American power is because the only country that comes close to competing with the United States is a brutal authoritarian regime that has only grown more brutal with time. You are, of course, referring to China. Is that, do you think, the best argument for U.S. power?
It's an argument. I think it's an important argument because we have to live in the real world. We can't compare. Look, I wish there was a morally perfect superpower. I fantasize about the U.S. being a giant human rights organization that just goes around doing good things. But that's not the world we live in. Military force is required. There is evil in the world. The U.S. has to protect some of its own interests some of the time. And it can be ruthless when it does that. And I think any superpower is not going to meet our expectations in that regard because power is a complicated thing and it corrupts.
Mm-hmm. I agree,
but at the same time, if we compare America to the available alternatives, I do think that clarifies matters a little bit because China is the competitor. And I use these words in the book. I do consider the U.S. to be morally superior.
Yeah, you use that phrase,
because we're better, because we are a democracy. And I want Americans to be more comfortable saying that out loud without feeling sheepish about it. We're not morally equivalent. We're not the same.
Which part of that sentence makes America morally superior? The democracy part?
Because we have the ability to improve and change and be better. Where if a Chinese citizen doesn't like what the dear leader is doing, they have no real recourse. There's nothing they can do to change the policy. If we don't like what our country is doing in the Middle East or in Gaza, we at least have an opportunity to elect leaders who think differently. So there's always a possibility of self-correction. That's at the heart of the American story. I know that sounds a little bit trite, but I do think it's true. It's
surprisingly thin gruel on which to base a philosophy. I mean, if you're thinking of, you just given one example of your own youthful dalliance with politics, where you said, you're trying to stop the Iraq war, it didn't work. There are other examples, the Gaza war, that the world has tried to stop, it didn't work. So where is this ability to change the U.S. from within or without?
So Barack Obama was elected after George W. Bush. I don't think that would have happened if it wasn't for the anti-war sentiment in the country. I think Donald Trump also benefited from that too. And he's been very critical, whether we believe him or not, or he's totally sincere. He does talk a lot about kind of ending these forever wars, including in the new national security strategy that was just released. And Donald Trump did basically destroy the neocon faction of the Republican Party, in part because so many Americans had become disillusioned after the Iraq War. So I think it is possible for America to move in different directions. I think we're already seeing how the Democratic Party is becoming more pro-Palestine. Certainly that's where the base of the party is. And the fact that someone like Zoran could actually become the leader of the most important city in the world, or the second most important city in the world if we include DC. I think that says something about new possibilities. Someone who calls Gaza a genocide could actually be the mayor of New York City. I think there are things to be positive about. Things are shifting.
Well, as I said, I mean, this is why I think I consider it to be slightly thin gruel. If Zoran can be the mayor of New York, and then what? And then what? Do the weapons stop flowing to Israel? What changes? On a macro scale, on the big things that America can do in the world.
I think that if a Democrat wins in 2028, there is going to be pressure to take a stronger stand on Israel. I think that the idea of suspending arms shipments and using our leverage with Israel in that way has grown more popular in the Democratic Party. And you see more and more senators calling that out and saying that outright without apology. So if that actually becomes more reflected in our policy, I think it's possible that in 5, 10, 15 years, we could have a Democratic Party that is seriously putting pressure on Israel. That doesn't mean we'll end the relationship with Israel altogether. Again, we have to be realistic. But is it possible that the U.S. will begin putting serious pressure on its Israeli counterparts? I think that is actually within reach, but it's only within reach if Americans believe in the American project. If they exit the political system and resign themselves to the unfortunate reality, then they're conceding the ground. Then we're not going to be able to change things from within the system. So that's a big part of the message. Stay within the system, fight for what you believe in, and believe in the democratic process.
If you were having this conversation with young Shadi, with, his wonderful long, big locks. Yeah, I still have very big hair, but you have these kind of. I imagine you wearing bell bottoms in the 2000s, and a bit of a hippie in DC. But if you were having this conversation with him, and you would say to him, what? That get involved in the democratic process, and in 15 years Iraq could never happen, and there would never be another war in the Middle East that the US was part of.
That wouldn't have been convincing to 2003 Shadi, but 2003 Shadi is no longer with us. I think there is something. I think there's something about youth that makes it harder to compromise, to accept those kind of difficult middle ground positions. But I think at some level we have to go beyond the Chomsky-esque critique. We have to be able to provide something positive, a vision for moving forward. And I know that it's not going to be convincing necessarily to a lot of young people, but I don't see what the alternative is.
Yeah, well, I think that's why I find the moral aspect of it interesting, because it strikes me that regardless of whether America wants to change or can change, it remains an established fact. Like, American military power exists, and regardless of the apologies or the mea culpas or the we'll change in 15 years, we've elected Zoran Mandani, there's no suggestion, even from liberals like yourself, that America will ever give up the ability to act. So American military power is a real thing. It has the ability to act in the world. What difference does it make why it does so, or what values we ascribe to it? It's still going to do it.
But it's people who make those choices, and individuals have motivations and intentions, and they can be judged accordingly. I think sometimes we talk about the U.S. as this kind of unitary actor that is beyond anyone's control, that it will just do whatever it does.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of built-in inertia that requires us to accept things the way they are. But individuals change policy. And again, I think I'll point to the example of Donald Trump, who has been able to alter U.S. foreign policy in significant ways. If you really have someone at the top of the chain who has ideas and a vision, even if we don't like that vision, that person can actually alter the course of American history.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. And I have to admit that, as somebody who believes that America has certain interests and the government acts in the interests of its own interests, it's amazing that Donald Trump is the politician that makes you think, what, actually, that could be something to consider. It really does seem like Trump has changed the way America does politics.
Exactly. It is pretty remarkable. And I think Trump has expanded the Overton window. If Trump is able to do it, then someone on the left might be able to do it. It becomes possible to think about a Bernie Sanders-like presidency that actually tries something fundamentally different in terms of thinking about America's role in the world. And I want us all to be open to that. I think the other part, and I think you sort of alluded to this, American power is not going away. People can talk about the rise of China all that they want. I tend to think that the rise of China has been wildly overstated, and that China doesn't actually have a realistic shot at overtaking the U.S. And I lay out the case for why in the book. There's a number of reasons. I think one of them comes back to the question of democracy versus autocracy. I think China is fundamentally limited by the fact that it doesn't enjoy the consent of the governed. It's not able to self-correct in the way that we do. It's too dependent on one person. And we saw what that looked like during COVID, where because President Xi was so obsessed with the zero COVID policy, he ground the Chinese economy to a halt. And it took China, and China might never fully recover from that economically. We avoided that, and we can avoid that because we actually have fractious and vibrant discussion and debate where we have different perspectives and people can challenge the ruler.
Yeah, this is why I'm trying to avoid having the conversation about whether democracy is better than authoritarianism, because I don't think that's up for debate. I think democracy is definitely better. My issue is much more with this idea that American power has this moral dimension to it, or that Western power has this moral dimension to it. That's the part that I don't fully agree with. And I worry that when you talk about democratic exceptionalism, it sounds to me like it's just a way of avoiding confronting the fact that these states, and I don't just mean America, I mean Britain and other countries as well, they have their own interests in the world. It doesn't really matter what their moral character is. What matters is their interests. It doesn't even matter if they're democracies. They're going to behave according to the interests of those states.
So when I talk about individual intentions, I'll just give one example. As terrible as the Iraq War was, I don't think that Bush administration officials or George W. himself were waking up in the morning and thinking to themselves, we want to kill Iraqis. I think there was actually a sense that this could be better for Iraqis. It was obvious, again,
really, Shadi.
If we look at what George W. Bush said and what we also know from people who knew him intimately, he did have this idea of a freedom agenda. And there was a time briefly in 2004 and 2005 when the Bush administration was putting pressure on Arab dictators to open up their political systems. There was a sense of promise there. And I remember there was a sense of optimism in the region. I was living in Jordan at the time, and there was a sense of openness. It was real. But not just, I mean, that's obviously a very small period in time.
Yeah.
But it's also true that post-World War II saw a dramatic expansion in the number of democracies across the globe. And that was part of America's declared policy to actually reflect those ideals in the building of international institutions after Bretton Woods, of trying to actually help Europe become prosperous and democratic and not going to war with each other. The project of the EU wouldn't have been possible without the American security umbrella. I mean, the record isn't all bad. There are things that we can look back to and say we're proud of that. Also, the intervention in Bosnia, we helped end the Bosnian genocide.
Absolutely.
The ethnic cleansing in Kosovo in 1999.
Yep.
When Iraq
Sierra
invaded.
Leone.
Yeah, I mean, there are examples. I mean, the first Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, I think it was a good thing that we stopped that from proceeding. No one else could have done that but us. So some of that is animated by a moral interest. And we can see that in the statements of officials at that time. They were wrestling with these kinds of moral questions of whether to intervene and how to intervene. Libya in 2011 is another example. Barack Obama did not want to intervene, but it was several of his top aides, including Ben Rhodes and Samantha Power, who called on America's better angels and said, this is not who we are. A mass slaughter is underway. Gaddafi is marching towards Benghazi. We have the power and ability to stop this brutality. And ultimately we did. It doesn't mean that Libya turned out great, and that's a whole story on its own.
Is it a whole story on its own? Or is it the direct consequence of intervention in that way?
The civil war in Libya, which started in earnest in 2014, that didn't happen right after the intervention.
True.
The intervention succeeded on its own terms of stopping mass killing and preventing Libya from becoming another Syria. Syria is an example of what happens when you don't intervene. Hundreds of thousands were killed. In Libya, in the Libyan civil war, in the first 2 years, about 4,500 people were killed. The numbers were much less. It was still a civil war, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been if Gaddafi had stayed in power. So I think the lesson there might actually be something quite different, is that we didn't stay involved after the intervention. The world looked the other way and forgot about Libya and didn't play any role in trying to stabilize it. And I think that there's a counterfactual history we can look at if there was more investment in Libya's future. But at the very least, the Libyan opposition was calling for the world to stop their own killing and the massacres that were underway. And the U.S. didn't really have a direct vital interest. The U.S. could have been like, why do we care about Libya? But that was the kind of moral aspiration that drove that. And we see that in different periods, time and time again, where U.S. officials, whether it's contemporaneously or in their own memoirs, they do talk about wrestling with the moral questions. At least they're wrestling with them.
Well, you've made this distinction previously in writing between Iraq, which you opposed, and then Syria, which you advocated for U.S. intervention in, as you've just said. It's an interesting proving ground, I think, for the argument. Your distinction at the time is that between Syria and Iraq is that, quote, there was nothing dramatic happening in Iraq when we invaded. So there were no protests, there was no civil war, nothing. Whereas in Syria, something quite dramatic was happening. And therefore, the motivation of the intervener matters. That if the US had intervened, even if, in a limited way at that point, that would have been seen as a positive intervention.
Yes, exactly. I think that's a moral stain on our record. Obama did talk about a red line of chemical weapons. And in August 2013, we were very close to using military force against the Assad regime, and we backed down. And Obama had doubts at the very last moment. And I think that should stay with us for a long time. It's a lesson that intervention can be bad, but non-intervention can also be bad. Not doing anything can also be destructive. And that's a choice that we make. And I know that the Syrian protesters and the Syrian opposition more broadly felt very much betrayed by Obama.
Yeah, right.
And I think rightly so. And I think we were partly responsible for what continued there, the killing that continued. And we could have stopped it. I mean, the Assad regime was a paper tiger. It doesn't have a strong military, as we've seen recently, since it was overthrown earlier this year. With air power and with the rebels marching towards Damascus when they were in the advantage, that could have tipped the balance and pushed things over the edge. And I think that opportunity was lost.
I completely agree with you. I mean, I was in favor of U.S. intervention in Syria for exactly that reason, which is to say that it always seemed like it was a very fragile state, and all it would take was just a little bit of a decapitation strategy, and ideally somebody else would take over, which is exactly what happened last year. But I think where I've come to over the years is to wonder, how much do the intentions of the intervention matter? Meaning, whenever somebody that is not liberal wants to intervene, and it's often intervening in an Arab country, there's always an explanation for it. You can always find an explanation for it. You can say, well, we have to protect human rights in Afghanistan, or we have to remove Gaddafi in Libya. There's always some explanation, but the end result, when you step back over years and decades, is always to weaken Arab nations, always to destroy the stability of the states, always to kill people. It always ends up that way, every single time, without any single exception. So I wonder how liberals looking at that pass that. Do they say, does it matter if the bad thing happens after, as long as we went in for the right reasons?
I think intentions matter, even on a moral level. I mean, there is the prophetic saying in Islam that actions are judged based on their intentions. I don't necessarily want to apply that to entire nations, but I think there is something important there, that at the end of the day, when we're facing God, he's going to ask us why we did what we did, and that matters. And hopefully that'll be taken into account. That's cold comfort to people who were on the receiving end, and they may not care what American intentions were. But I also think that morality does actually give us a kind of guiding light. It gives us a North Star. And my argument would be, let's try to be more moral, not less. Let's try to actually have good intentions, but also good strategy. And also thinking very seriously about what our ultimate interests are in the Middle East. Is our ultimate goal to keep the Middle East weak so Israel can be dominant. I don't think that's in America's interests. Keeping Arabs in this kind of despondent, dependent position is going to make the region a breeding ground for conflict and chaos for the rest of our lives. I don't think it's in America's interest to do this. I do think it's in America's interest to have more democratic systems emerge in the Middle East that can be real, genuine partners with us. Because authoritarian regimes are not real partners. They don't share our values, and oftentimes they don't share our interests. We can see what the UAE is doing right now in Sudan, and that's a close U.S. ally that is facilitating mass killing there. Authoritarian regimes are destructive. They're expansionist. They don't actually do the things that we want them to do. Even if we have leverage over them, we should use our leverage to push them in another direction, but we don't do that. And I think what I'm trying to offer here is a roadmap of thinking about American power in a different way. We can criticize, I think liberals should criticize the record. And I've criticized the record myself, and I catalog a lot of those sins in the book. I have a whole chapter on hypocrisy where I really dutifully lay that out, because I want people to love America and to believe in it and to want it to be better. Doesn't mean whitewashing our sins. It means acknowledging our sins and trying to be better than we were before. That is the promise of America. But again, I would say that I don't know what the alternative. The alternative is business as usual. The alternative is just doing what we've always done.
Well, when we're talking about allies who are destructive, let's get to the Gaza war in Israel. Do you think, this is a good way into it, do you think that the Gaza war basically screwed your book?
Did it screw my book?
Because basically, I mean, if you had written this book 5 years ago, it would have been a much easier sell. You're writing it now at the end of 2 years of mass killing.
And I had doubts about the book precisely because of Gaza. I did have a crisis of faith after October 7th, and I wondered, could I really make these arguments and could I stand by them?
Yeah.
Did it really make sense for me to speak to my fellow Arab and Muslim Americans and tell them that they should believe in a case for American power?
Yeah.
And that's why the book, I think, there's a lot of anguish in it.
It does feel like you're thinking it through at the time of writing, yeah.
Exactly. In some ways, I'm the audience. I'm trying to convince myself of something I'm not entirely sure about. And I want the reader to walk with me and wrestle with these questions themselves. And if they can see me working through it, maybe they can work through it too.
Well, that's why. So, Shadi, this is why I was so interested in having this conversation with you right now, because exactly as you say, like when you read the book, it does feel as if you are working through something as an American and someone who has other identities as well. And one of the reasons that I think this conversation is so fascinating from my perspective is that, you're obviously an enormously intellectual guy. And we've had other people on the podcast who thought about it in the same way, and they've come to the opposite conclusion. I'm thinking about Omar Lakhad, the novelist. And so with you, you've worked through this. You've seen what has happened. You're not trying to whitewash the crimes of the past, and you're certainly not trying to avoid a discussion of the genocide. And yet, you have come to the conclusion that even in spite of the last 2 years, you can still defend American power.
Well, I think Gaza is a betrayal of everything that we stand for and believe in as a country. I think it's just a violation of the worst kind of American ideals, but also American interests. And
but a violation, Shadi, that two separate presidents have continued. Very different presidents, by the way. You could say Biden was a continuation of the old democratic order. Trump certainly wasn't. And yet both of them have continued to support Israel during those wars.
And America will have to atone for those sins for the rest of our lifetimes. And I think we can atone for our sins. I want Gaza to also be seen as a kind of before and after. That before Gaza, we could kind of just like middle about and continue having a bad policy in the Middle East, business as usual. I think Gaza can force a new generation to think differently about what America's purpose in the world is, and to finally be the country that I think most of us want us, at least most Democrats want us to be. That is the challenge. And I don't want people to lose faith because of Gaza, because I think the risk is, and this, I think this is, as I mentioned earlier, the predominant position in a lot of progressive circles. They see Gaza as the end of the American project, as the end of the American idea abroad.
Right.
I just don't know where that leads us. If you really believe that this is the end and that America will never recover from the role that it played in facilitating a genocide, then what do we have left as Americans? Why should I get up and write and do what I do? At the end of the day, I have to believe in something, and it is my country, and I believe that it's better. I believe that it's much better than this, that it can be much better than this, and that we have no other option, and that I'm committed to it. In some sense, America is almost like a faith. It's like it's an idea that we commit to. And even if the idea falls short, it doesn't mean that the idea was wrong. When ideas don't, like, even if you think about how religion works, if a lot of Muslims do bad things in the name of Islam and Muslims just behave terribly in certain parts of the world and don't live up to the example of their religion, we don't say, let's just discard the religion. We say Muslims aren't living up to the ideals. And then we ask Muslims to close the gap and to be better because we believe in Islam. Similarly, I believe in America, maybe not as a faith in the same way, but as an idea that is worth standing by and committing to. So that's kind of the challenge I'm putting to people.
I think this is why I'm finding this conversation very interesting, but also that, I had this conversation with the podcaster and analyst Jasmine Al-Gamal, and she, very much like you, is similar ethnic background, American as well, also very aware of the worst excesses of America. She was actually in Guantanamo, so she knows the detail of what the sharp end of empire looks like. And yet she has come to a very similar conclusion that you have, that both of you are emotional about America. You care about America. You want this nation to succeed for you, for yourself, and yet you can't help but be perennially disappointed. And in both cases, I kind of wonder, like you've given the example of America as a religion. I wonder if it's more like a jilted lover. Like you just can't believe that it keeps doing these things to you.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up the example of a jilted lover. I mean, Jasmine's a good friend, and I'm not surprised that we kind of come to a similar conclusion on this because I think we are animated by something similar. I think this is the case with a lot of children of immigrants, especially Muslim Americans. There's an attachment that I think it's a complicated story for a lot of us, our generation post 9/11, and trying to find out where we belong in this broader story of America. And because America has given so much to us and our families, I think there is a sense of love that is deep.
That's a big part of the story, I think. Absolutely.
Yes,
Absolutely.
And it is emotional and it's not entirely rational.
Yeah.
But I think there's also something to be said for believing in one's own country, regardless of your own backstory. It's the only country that most of us have, at least if we're American. I mean, this is it, really.
Yeah.
So in some sense, we're swinging big on this idea because what else do we got? It's not as if there are other lovers who are competing for our attention that are actually viable partners for marriage.
Yeah. to continue the jilted lover analogy, yeah. Well, let's talk a bit about you as a liberal, because you've described yourself as a liberal, and you've become one of the more forceful defenders of American power. And I think a lot of liberals see American power as something to be restrained rather than something, as I think you are, affirming. When you argue that people should be interested in American power and support it, what part of that liberal worldview do you think needs revising or even abandoning?
I think that the kind of liberal left criticisms, I think there's a skittishness about power.
Right. Yeah.
I think there's just a profound discomfort with the idea of having a military that is used as a military is meant to be used, which does require at times violence and killing.
Absolutely, right.
And I think it would be a challenge if someone like Bernie Sanders was at the head, was the commander in chief. Wrestling with that would have been a fascinating counterfactual. And I do wish And I supported Bernie, actually, in 2020.
Yeah.
Actually worked on his foreign policy team, oddly enough. But I wish that we could have played that out, and then folks on the left could really have at least something to look at as a model, or even if the model failed, even if Bernie didn't end up doing a great job, we'd at least have some experience with what it means to wield power and to try to be moral about it.
You must have been, I didn't realize that you had served on, let's say, in this foreign policy committee. You must have been very comfortable. You must have been very uncomfortable with the idea of not using American power. Because, as you say, the Bernie Sanders worldview is one in which the levers of American power, or any Western power, any power at all, won't be used. And, for those of us who have potentially thought about what a country might be if it were run by somebody very left-wing, I'm thinking of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, it's actually profoundly frightening. You may agree with their social programs or their ideas towards the poor or towards foreign policy, but when you think about the defense of the homeland, the defense of the cities that you live in, that's actually very frightening, because I don't think some of these politicians would be able to handle it in the way that we want it handled.
This is where I saw Bernie Sanders as the best of the available options. Again, I try to be pragmatic, and I can't have everything that I want because my particular constellation of ideas is kind of odd and rare, and people don't know what to make of me. So in some sense, I was an odd man out in that kind of context. What I did like about Bernie is that there was a moral sensibility. And I thought that was the most important thing, especially on Israel, Palestine, and having a more balanced policy, being more critical of Israel and pressuring Israel. But also Bernie Sanders really emphasized this idea of anti-authoritarianism, that we should rethink our alliances in the Middle East with all of these brutal dictators. And that, to me, would have been an example of using American power, using our leverage to pressure these regimes to not be as bad as they were.
Yeah.
And even if Bernie was less interventionist on something like Syria, I don't think Bernie Sanders would have intervened militarily against the Assad regime.
Absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely.
But I can't have everything that I want, and I think baby steps is always the way to go. If you're going to be involved in politics, you find candidates who align with you on some things rather than others, and then you hope for the best and you try to make your case internally. But I do think I think Bernie would have been forced he would have been forced to defend the homeland. If there were terrorist threats, he would have had to use the military. And there would have been traditional Democrats in his administration who had a more kind of muscular vision of America's role.
Yeah.
Personnel matters, and you can't staff your entire administration with a bunch of leftists. You need to mix it up a little bit. So I don't know. I think it's a real open question as to what that would have looked like in practice.
Okay, let's keep moving, because I unfortunately, we don't have you like a Joe Rogan podcast length, so we only have a few minutes left. But I wanted to talk to you about Islamism, because one of the reasons I said this to you before we started recording, that one of the reasons that I've enjoyed your work so much over the years is that you're one of the few Western liberals that takes Islamism as a phenomenon seriously and doesn't try to think of it as something that needs to be uprooted, but as a real political and social force in the Arab world. Why do you think the general consensus in the West is to view it as a problem to be solved? Actually, frankly, to be speaking, not just in the West, the Arabs think of it the same way, some of them.
I think there's a fundamental discomfort with Islam's role in political life. And in one of my earlier books, Islamic Exceptionalism, I made the argument that Islam was fundamentally different than other religions, particularly in how it relates to politics. Islam, in my view, is simply more resistant to secularization. I don't think Islam is going to go through a reformation and an enlightenment the way that Christianity did, nor should it, because Islam is a different religion with a different founding story. Prophet Muhammad was not a rebel against a reigning state like Jesus was. He was a statesman, a head of state, a leader, a warrior. He played all those roles simultaneously, along with being a prophet. So I think that fundamentally shapes Islam in a way that is hard for Westerners to understand. I think Westerners have just a fundamental discomfort with the idea of Islamic law or Sharia, or the idea that majorities in much of the Arab world want Sharia to play a greater role in public life. I think for the kind of standard Western liberal, it's like, how is this still possible in the 21st century? And so what I've advocated in my previous writing, including in my previous book, The Problem of Democracy, is that we have to separate small L liberalism and small D democracy. Not everyone has to be a classical liberal. Not everyone has to love John Locke and John Stuart Mill. Not everyone has to follow in that course. If Arabs decide that they want Islam to be more central in public life and even in the law, I think democracy requires us to respect that, because what is democracy? It's the right to make the wrong choice. But the problem is we as Americans don't respect it when other people make bad choices. But we make bad choices all the time. We voted for Donald Trump twice. That is at the heart of that is a democratic outcome. And that's why I've been very vocal too about not painting Donald Trump and his supporters as deplorables and saying that they're illegitimate. That if Americans want to vote for someone like Donald Trump, that is their will and choice. And if Europeans want to vote for far-right parties, I mean, everyone is voting for right-wing populists now. It's not just Arabs who vote for right-wing Islamists, you know? So
conservative
I think we really have
groups
to get over this fear of Islamism. And we don't have to like the Brotherhood. We can think that they're bad and dangerous. Part of democracy is you don't always get your way, and people who you don't like win elections. I think that is the fundamental obstacle in how so many people think about the Middle East. We can't get our heads around the idea that groups like the Muslim Brotherhood cannot be destroyed. They can be destroyed organizationally, but as an idea, this idea that Islam and Islamic law playing a political role, that's not going to go away.
I agree with you. I mean, I see Islamism in much the same way. But explain to me then, what would you say to your liberal friends in the region who are genuinely concerned about Islamism? Because the criticism of Islamism is not just something that comes from the West. It is something that is inherent to the Arab world. If you believe Islamism is part of the Arab world, well, the dislike of Islamism is also part of the Arab world. So what do you say to those people who are genuinely afraid of the rise of Islamism, genuinely afraid of these Islamist parties?
I mean, what I have tended to say to them, and this includes most of my relatives in Egypt who hate the Muslim Brotherhood and think that they're like, Shadi, you're coming in as an American and you're telling us about democracy, but we're the ones who have to live with the consequences of democracy. Yeah. But I mean, what I would tell them is look at the alternative, the brutal regime of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and they would say Arabs just aren't ready for democracy. That's something I unfortunately hear too often from friends and relatives in a place like Egypt. What I would tell them is that
but that's not the best argument for why people may not like Islamism. They don't like Islamism not because they think Arabs aren't ready for democracy. They don't like Islamism because they're worried about what it might do to their social rights, whether it will force them to wear certain clothes, things like that.
And I think the argument there is when Islamists have been in positions of power, have they done those things? Mohammed Morsi was only in power for 1 year, so we don't exactly know how it would have played out. But it's not as if Morsi was going around implementing Sharia law. We have another example of Ghannouchi in Tunisia and the PJD in Morocco, who were in positions of executive authority. And was it the end of the world? Did Rashid Ghannouchi, he was actually very compromising on issues like women's rights and freedom of speech. And I actually think he was a visionary leader in trying to come to some kind of modus vivendi between Islam and democracy. It is possible, but you can only know that if you let the process play out. So there is a risk.
Yeah, I'm very sensitive to this because I interviewed Ghannouchi during the revolution in Tunisia, so I'm very aware of how that story played out. But with the Brotherhood in particular in Egypt, you say they only had 1 year. There were a lot of people who wanted the Brotherhood to go, and when they saw the opportunity to remove Morsi from power, they took it. To those people, in the run-up to that, when they said we are worried about what the Brotherhood might do, we are particularly women, where they said we're worried that they might take rights from us, is the best answer that we as outsiders can give to say, yeah, you got to let the process play out. If that happens, you got to live with it.
Well, first of all, I think the idea that the Brotherhood was going to impose hijab, that was never part of their platform or anything anyone advocated. I think there was a 0% chance of that happening. Does the Brotherhood believe in full gender equality in the Western liberal sense? No. But then again, a lot of people in Egypt don't believe in full gender equality in the Western liberal sense. So liberals are the minority on some of those questions. I don't know what else to say, but democracy, I mean, at some level, democracy is messy and chaotic, and there is going to be a push and pull. But if the only alternative you can come up with is a dictatorship, I always tend to think that a somewhat illiberal Islamist government that's democratically elected is better than the alternative of brutal dictatorship. Not everyone agrees with that, but their fears, I think, are, it's understandable that people would be fearful about things they've never experienced before. We don't know what the Brotherhood would do, but that also makes it very hard for me to make the case for them to be comfortable with democracy, because I can't guarantee to them that everything is going to go fine.
Yeah. I mean, the trajectory of women's rights under Trump has not gone very well either.
Yeah. And at some level, democracy, as hard as it might be to hear, sometimes things won't go well for certain groups after certain elections. But you fight back through the democratic process, not through coups. There was more and more popular opposition to Morsi. If there had been another election, Morsi and the Brotherhood wouldn't have done as well. But we just don't know for sure. And the military would have still been there, being a kind of pressure point on the Brotherhood. It's not as if the Brotherhood would have been able to do whatever it wanted. There was still a deep state. There was still this kind of apparatus that was keeping the Brotherhood in check. So I think a lot of these fears of worst case scenarios and another Iranian revolution and all of that, it wasn't based on any available evidence. It was based on fear. And my message would be, you can't base your politics around fears of things that haven't happened yet.
Let's end on this, to go back right to the start about your unconventional route through liberalism, because obviously now you're defending Islamism and then you're defending American power. These are not particularly popular things on the left. I wonder if it has cost you friendships over the years. Maybe cost you a lot of friendships recently with this new book.
I wouldn't say it's, well, during the Arab Spring, there were certainly tensions between Egyptian family members and Egyptian friends of mine who were quite secular, and I had a falling out with a couple people for some of the reasons I just mentioned, that they saw me as an interloper who was trying to impose democracy on them as this kind of American coming in. But I've been on the losing battle of a lot of these debates, and it's frustrating. So I think that I've alienated people, maybe. I've maybe lost certain opportunities. I don't know. I think being on the losing side of big ideological debates has had an effect on me. It's sometimes, I don't want to say it depresses me, but it's hard sometimes to argue for things that are just unpopular, and it can feel really like an uphill battle. And there's something masochistic about it. Maybe I bring this upon myself, this desire. Some people call me a contrarian. I don't love that because it implies that I'm making arguments for argument's sake. But I really do believe in these things. They're really important to me. And that's how I keep on going in all of this. That at the end of the day, I have to be true to what I believe, even if it's not going to be popular. I do worry about this book, that people are going to see me in a certain way. And as the book's been coming out, and even beforehand, when I was kind of previewing it, people would ask me, like, what's the title of the book, Shadi? Especially like Arab and Muslim friends. And I would feel almost sheepish about telling them the title, because I didn't want them to judge me or think of me in a negative way. So I had to qualify and caveat, and would be like, guys, don't get the wrong idea. It's more nuanced than you think. And the best I can do is just try to be as clear and nuanced, which is sometimes a challenge, as I can possibly be. And then the rest is up to God. The rest of it's out of my control, but at least I've done my part and made my arguments. People can reject them, and a lot of them probably will, but maybe some people will be persuaded. And at the end of the day, that's what a writer hopes for. And maybe that's enough in the end.
Shadi Hamid, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines Magazine. Shadi Hamid's book, The Case for American Power, is out now and available online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.